It is my honor and my pleasure to be here today. I was asked to prepare a lecture for the end of the Master in Cooperation, I mean the 14th edition if I'm not wrong. And I decided to present a lecture on some selected aspects of what I would call the political economy of international aid in the Mediterranean region, in particular in the Arab countries, by looking in the first part of my lecture at the past 20 years policies adopted by the European Union and by the American administrations, USAID in particular. First of all, to put those policies into perspective with what has been happening and how, the so-called Arab Springs, and I would use the term plural because the events that have been unfolding in several Arab countries, though they may have common items, still they have to be understood also according to some of their particularities. After having summarized a little bit the main policies of the EU and the USAID towards the Mediterranean Basin, the southern and eastern shore, I will rather dwell on more recent events, again looking at the European Union policies in the wake of the Arab Spring. Basically, how and if the European Union has been learning some lessons from that, and I will go through mainly three new documents that the European Union has approved, and they are on the table in Brussels to be implemented actually starting from February 2012. And finally, I will end by trying to put together some questions more than receipts related to the linkage between international aid, economic development policies, and processes of democratization. So, if I should quickly sum up the period, say, between the end of the Cold War, basically the early 90s, up to the Arab Springs, 2011, I would say that we can characterize that 2 decades according to 3 main phases. If you look, first of all, on the European side, the policies that have been characterizing the intervention of European state members in the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean Basin has been basically dictated by the so-called Barcelona Process or the Euro-Mediterranean Process. The Barcelona Process actually came up in the wake of the end of the Gulf War of 1991, and more than that, in the wake of the Oslo Agreement, the agreement between the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the government of Israel, signed in Washington in September 1993, an agreement that was set to agree about a peace agreement. The Oslo Agreement was not a peace agreement, was an agreement to discuss basically how Palestinians and Israelis were going to make peace, and they had a 5-year lapse of time to reach an agreement on a possible peace agreement. So what happens in this phase of the Barcelona process, which basically lasts officially until 2002 and 2003 for the European Union, the European Union, through the Barcelona process, is officially putting forward the 3 main pillars for its policy. an economic, a security, and the cultural pillar in terms of partnership to be materialized through cooperation agreement. But when we look more closely how the three pillars were implemented, actually the economic cooperation pillar was the most important one. And the objective was to push forward a neoliberal agenda in the southern shore, on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, and basically push forward trade liberalization policies. This, say, was the dominant pattern and in terms of also expenditures of the European Union, say that almost 75%, 3/4 of the investments were in the economic cooperation and in the trade liberalization policies. The security was a mild aspect, not to speak about cultural policies, I mean in terms of expenditures. Trade liberalization policies have been, however, quite selective. The EU, in fact, has demonstrated its entrenched reluctance to move towards a liberalization, for example, of its highly protectionistic agricultural markets to the south. Therefore, for most South Mediterranean countries, the liberalization has remained rather virtual than real in terms of how they could market their own products into the EU member states. On the other side, the issue of trade liberalization, no matter how it can be approved or contested ideologically, if you look in terms of how the implementation of a liberalization for Arab economies, directed for most of them by authoritarian regime, a true process of liberalization would have actually helped in, let's say, producing political change inside those regimes. Actually, reducing tariff barriers would have been central to dismantling the monopolistic privileges enjoyed by the ruling elites and their entourage, which actually was not implemented. Now, while the Barcelona process and the European Union was basically focusing in the second half of the 90s and early 2000s its activities on the economic expansion of its own market and trading opportunities, USAID and the American administration had another strategic plan, the famous strategic plan for sustainable democracy, which was formally put on paper in 1997. It was differently from the Barcelona process, was rather looking at the importance of civil society and the importance of civil society for promoting democratization. Those two processes came some way brutally to an end following 9 September 2001. September 2001 constituted an important watershed for overseas development aid policies, both for the European Union and the US. The US and its conservative advisors quickly developed a quite clear vision of how to fight terrorism. The policy was to promote democratization processes in the Arab world by fighting corruption and repression that was feeding unrest, Islamic fundamentalism, and terrorism. It was clear that economic development and growth had not produced political stability and political liberalization. Therefore, the main policy adopted under the Bush administration, starting from 2001, the two Bush administration that followed each other from 2001 up to 2009, were focusing on a top-down imposition of democracy. The example, and I would say the catastrophic example, has been in fact Iraq. And I would say that nobody at that time listened to a quite wise man, a diplomat, a famous diplomat, Lord Chris Patten, was the last governor of Hong Kong, and was between 2002 and, from 92 to 97, Chris Patten was actually the EU Commissioner for External Relations. He wrote in a famous paper that democracy doesn't flow from the barrel of a gun, but through respecting the will of the people. Nobody listened to him, and let's say that if on the one side the American administration tried to impose democratization from the top, differently from what they've been doing in the 90s, the other way around was the process that was adopted by the European Union. The European Union, starting in the early 2000s, was conscious that the Euro-Mediterranean partnership had failed and had died with the beginning of the Second Intifada in Palestine. From 2002-2003, the European Union began to extend the European neighborhood policy it applied successfully to the Eastern European countries to the Mediterranean Basin countries. The stick and the carrot was not, however, applying in the same way, because there was not a plan to extend membership of the EU to the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean countries. There are two examples, by the way. Morocco had asked for membership in the European Union in late 1987 to no avail, and only Israel and Turkey had asked for membership, but in the first case, in the case of Israel, it never materialized in a clear project. The new extended European neighborhood policy aimed at a bottom-up democratization process through aid with the same intention of the US, but with a specific European flavor. Promotion of democracy and human rights by empowering civil societies while pursuing the objective of reinforcing the neoliberal project of economic partnership and trade liberalization. However, the policy of supporting civil society and human rights organizations was largely a function of the good relationship to be maintained with the local autocratic regimes, considered the promoters of political stability and an insurance against Islamic terrorism. In no way the European bureaucrats in Brussels tried to learn lesson from the attitude of Europe in the late 80s, in relation in particular to Algeria. Following the 1988 legislative election in Algeria, the Algerian army intervened and stopped the democratic process for fear that Islamic fundamentalism was coming to power through democratic channels. What ensued has been more than 10 years of a civil war with more than 600,000 people that have been dying. And the problem has not been solved. But the European Union has rather preferred to close the eyes on a strategic partner, which is Algeria, or better, the Algerian regime, to be sure that its energetic needs in terms of gas were secured through the military regime. Now, in the same vein, the European Union, and more largely the US and the number of international donors, also accepted not to recognize Hamas in Palestine when they won the legislative election in 2006. Actually, one may think about the consequences of refusing to respect the choice of citizens of another country. The US and the EU, who want to promote democracy, have been those who themselves have refused to the Algerians and then successively to the Palestinians their right to self-determination in terms of choosing their own representatives. Now, the message that this denial of democracy has had has been rather to radicalize fundamentalist and extremist groups, since if you cannot get to power through democratic means and you are boycotted by the international community, what will be the way left? So radicalization and armed struggle is and has been for many years the only option left for Islamic radical groups. And those same Islamic radical groups, when we look at how Europe has been dealing with its own problems of terrorism in Europe, the day that the peace process in Northern Ireland was initiated was the day when IRA was welcomed around the table of negotiation. So far, the Algerian fundamentalists, as well as the Hamas representatives, have not yet been invited around the table of negotiations. And there is no hope, from my point of view, that a sustainable peace, like the bureaucrats in Brussels like to call it, can be forged out of a process of exclusion of some of the main partners in a conflict. So, to go back to my point, is that when I'm mentioning the role that the European Union had in the 2000, or at least until late 2010, was rather a role of paying lip service to the ideals of supporting and empowering civil society, but in fact trying to pursue the economic interests of European states member on the one side, and on the other side to secure the stability by giving support to the autocratic regimes. There are many examples that we can give. If you take the revolts in Gafsa in 1997, or all the Ayman Noor in Egypt at the time of the last election, not the recent one. I mean, there are all a number of examples where, notwithstanding the fact that the European Union was supporting free and fair election and civil society, they have not dared to take a stand like the one they are taking today, for example, towards Hungary, towards autocratic regimes in the Arab world. I think that one of the best assessments of the EU Mediterranean policy has been done by Stefan Füle, the European High Commissioner for the European Extended Neighborhood Policy, who in March 2011, when the Arab Spring was in full swing, said, I quote, "We must show humility about the past. Europe was not vocal enough to defend human rights and local democratic forces in the region. Too many of us fell prey to the assumption that authoritarian regimes were a guarantee of stability in the region. This was not even realpolitik. It was at best short-termism, and the kind of short-termism that makes the long term even more difficult." Now, as the European Union learned some lessons from its own past policies in the wake of the recent events of the Arab Springs, there are, I think, during the last year, three key moments where the European Union has been trying to develop a new policy. First, it was exactly in March 2011, in parallel to the declaration of Stefan Füle, a new commission in Brussels was set up to study what they called a new partnership for democracy and shared prosperity with the southern Mediterranean. Now, what this commission put forward in terms of tools for a new European neighborhood policy. The first and concrete act that they implemented was in terms of humanitarian aid and offering some 30 billion euros for emergency aid. But basically, they were reshuffling some of the old principles in a new context. Basically, they had 5 main pillars for a new policy based on what they called strategies for enhancing political dialogue and social dialogue. A second pillar was on tackling challenges of mobility. I mean, changing the perception of the role that migration should play in the Mediterranean region. They had a third pillar on promoting what they call now inclusive economic development, but again through promoting small and medium-sized enterprise and promote job creation and training. Fourth pillar, ensuring maximum impact of trade and investment by speeding up in particular negotiations about services. And this, when you look at the proposed budgets, will be again the lion's share in the new European neighborhood policy. Finally, a fifth pillar was rather dedicated to enhancing sectoral cooperation, in particular the project of creating a European Union South Mediterranean energy community, focusing on new cooperation program in education and development of new technology of information, internet in particular. The first document has been discussed over the summer, over the spring, and it was officialized in May 2011 by a document discussed also in the European Parliament under the heading of a new response to a changing neighborhood, where basically 2 decisions were taken in relation to what I mentioned before. Was a budgetary decision to have 1,242 million euros for the period 2012 and 2013, and modify in a cosmetic way some of the terms used. So the European Parliament found what I find quite a funny appellation by saying that they want to support deep democracy. What a deep democracy is actually is not very clear to me, but is to underline the wish or the will of the European Union to continue basically a policy and a support that is conditional on progress in building and consolidating democracy and especially respect for the rule of the law. If this will materialize is yet to be seen, but the latest concrete move of the European Union has actually taken place in December 2011 under the Polish presidency that has been preparing the file. The decision was taken to establish a European Endowment for Democracy. The European Endowment for Democracy follows very much the American National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up much earlier, which was one of the main tools used in the 90s under the Clinton administration to promote civil society and democracy in the Arab world. So the European Union seems now wanting to imitate some way the American administration by setting up themselves a similar instrument. It's difficult to, well, the allocation in terms of money for this new endowment would be 30 billion a year. in which way, if and how the European Union will keep the promise of disbursing or using the money that has been put on the budget is still to be seen, because as all of us we know, the economic situation in EU member states is rather critical at the moment, and it's difficult to forecast if possible engagements will be kept in the next couple of years. But how will this endowment add value to existing funding instruments at a time of economic upheaval? This has been the proper focus of debates among EU member states on the issue so far. Most experts recognize that potential partners in need of support, but which do not have the resources to jump through the administrative hoops associated with current EU programs, will welcome the possibilities of a more flexible approach. A fresh mandate for the endowment would also make it compatible with existing instruments, in particular the need to preserve funding for core human rights work under the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. As you see, the European Union has all a panoply of instruments that in principle should aid the Arab countries, the neighbor countries, for the transitions to democracy. And they are, at least on paper, again, wanting to favor, say, a bottom-up approach. Now, under this background, and I will conclude in this third part of my lecture, what are the challenges for the future that, with this background, the European Union in particular will have, or the Western world, if we put together the US and the European Union, what will be the challenges in accompanying the transition that are unfolding in a number of Arab countries? There is, first of all, a matter of credibility of Western donors' intention from the point of view of Arab societies. The Barack Obama discourse, for example, in Cairo after his election, and the incoherence of US policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the many issues that is always in the table. I would say that beyond or behind the single issues of Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, a key point that is becoming a cancer, both for the two enemies, for international donors and for the regime of the region, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Until or unless this conflict will be addressed in a proper way, peace, democracy, and political stability cannot come to most of the countries of the region. And the European Union cannot continue to put the problem under the carpet. Of course they can, but I'm not sure that will be the wisest policy they could adopt. For the moment, they have been basically doing what former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has been doing. Berlusconi, I was in Palestine when Berlusconi visited officially Israel in 2010, February 2010, and as an anecdote, I would like to repeat you what he officially said to the press in Israel. During his 4-day stay in Israel, he carved out half a day to pay visit to the Palestinian president of the Palestinian Authority in Bethlehem. So he was escorted by car to Bethlehem, and when you enter Bethlehem by the road that connects directly towards Jerusalem, you go through the wall. And the checkpoint where you enter into Bethlehem the wall is particularly important because it is a structure 8-meter high. It's very impressive. Berlusconi left Tel Aviv late in the morning and came back to Tel Aviv early in the evening. And the journalist of Haaretz, a newspaper of Israel, asked Prime Minister Berlusconi, so, Prime Minister, you visited the West Bank, you met with President Mahmoud Abbas, and were you impressed during your trip by the wall? And the first answer of Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has been to say, oh, you know, I was so concentrated on my discourse with President Mahmoud Abbas, and I didn't see anything. I was reading my discourse. Okay. And the journalist says, fine, but when you came back, you were not preparing another discourse. Said, yes, you are right, but coming back it was raining, and I had to change car, so there were all the umbrellas, and I could not see anything. But I believe in an economic peace. So the European Union has been buying basically into this discourse, negating what the colonial occupation of Israel has been creating in the occupied Palestinian territories on the other side, and imagining that an economic development can happen independently from the regime of occupation in Palestine. And the very clear alliance that most European member states and the US are having with Israel is jeopardizing their own policy with not only the Arab countries, but as well as with their plan for economic development, peace, and political stability. Not to speak about how, by closing their eyes on the issue, they are also contributing to condemn indirectly Israeli society and the Israeli youth that has been hostage for the past 50 years to their own army and to their own governments. I can develop on that if you want later on. But the first point is, I was saying in terms of challenges, the capacity of Western donors to equate discourse and practice. There is, second challenge, an important discrepancy between, say, foreign policy interests and objective of international cooperation. I mean by that when you look for most European member states at the level of bilateral cooperation, you will see that the budgets of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is often half of the budget of international cooperation. But the logic of the diplomats often prevails over the programs and the projects voted in Parliament by the cooperation agencies, the national cooperation agencies. Now, this is creating not only frustration among the personnel working for whatever international cooperation at the bilateral level, but as well as for the multilateral cooperation. The UN are actually the fig leaf of the international donors in the Middle East, who are incapable of taking genuine political decisions to address political issues, and they prefer to make their own citizens like us pay their taxes and with our money to support humanitarian aid, which in the case of Palestine is basically contributing to support the occupation. So I think that unless an European spring may happen, and it it is possible that may happen, starting not only looking outside Europe but inside Europe, and the problem that soon also most European countries, especially those of the northern shore of the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal, Greece have already begun, but it will be soon the turn of Italy and France. And when the civil society in Europe will open the eyes, I think we may hope for some change at the political level and how this may reverberate also on the foreign policy. It's not for tomorrow, but the economic crisis that is beginning to erode most certainties in most Western European countries will be probably setting some new scenarios. But more generally, I think that international and local observers have been torn among three main perspectives concerning the role of aid. First, in dominant perceptions, the West is idealized, while the Middle East and North African countries, political pathologies are often overemphasized. Basically, is the picturing Middle East and North African regime as neo-patrimonial, the role of Islam and authoritarianism in politics cannot be anymore taken for granted. It should be questioned. As I said before, giving the example of the Algerian elections of '88 or the 2006 election of Hamas, the representation that most governments have towards Islamic fundamentalism should be thought about. I mean, in as much as, let's take into another context, the communist experience has been giving example of more moderate to more absolutist vision or radical vision between Berlinguer in Italy and Stalin in Russia, there is an ocean. Now, why most public perception of Muslim Islamist movements are just taken on their extreme vision? I think there is an important work to be done at the level of European societies, not to speak about political leaders, of how to conceive its own neighbors. Second, a number of critics argue that aid does more harm than good, in part by reinforcing neo-patrimonial tendencies. Donors are overriding domestic accountability and crowding out local initiatives. Third cluster of the debates is that there is a significant current of thinking which considers that aid is needed and budget support is the least distortive modality, though it suggests that donors, the key to development, still need to engage in understanding politics. And actually, I would say that among these three big clusters of discussion, there are no recipes for what should be the right policies to be adopted. If we look at the latest debates on aid in effectiveness and policies on fragile states, the latest meeting that has occurred in Busan in South Korea in late November 2011, when you read the reports out of the meeting, you see very well how these three main cluster of questions come up recurrently. Many international organizations have been having, as I said in Busan, at the heart of the debates, the key question of ownership and the underlying issue of how democracy and development interrelate and affect each other. Aline Rocha-Menokal, who is a political economist who has been recently reporting on Busan, has put it in a recent essay from a normative perspective that it is much easier to assume that democracy and development automatically go hand in hand in mutually reinforcing ways. This is the thinking behind much of the good governance agenda championed by the international community since the 90s, even if democracy itself has not always been an explicit element of this support package. In many ways, this vision of the international community is understandable. To a great degree, it reflected and accompanied the wave of democratization that has swept across much of the developing world in the past 30 years, and which has now reached the Middle East and North Africa. What a democratic regime can actually deliver remains as relevant as ever. It speaks to a situation where high expectations that incipient democracies will deliver development have often proved unrealistic and were. Leaders find it hard to rise above immediate or partisan interests and embrace a sense of the broader public good. And if the top figures in the strongest democracy in the world can't do this, it seems even less likely that leaders in fragile democracies, where elections may be driven by a clientelistic logic, will be able to. The conundrum that countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, and elsewhere as well, face is twofold. They are trying both to democratize and, perhaps even more fundamentally, to build effective, capable states whose institutional grounding allows them to weather changes in leadership. Much as the international community would like to have it otherwise, these are not the one and the same thing. And to some degree, these two processes can also pull in different directions. For democratization often means establishing checks and balances, and diffusing power more evenly among more people within and outside the government, while strengthening state capacity may mean greater centralization of power and autonomy of those in charge. In many young democracies, especially the poorest and most fragile states, institutions are weak and ineffective, and the quality and capacity of the public sector remains limited. Here, the state cannot perform key functions, provide basic services, or respond to the needs of its citizens adequately. As a result, there is a real danger that the state loses legitimacy in the eyes of the population. In turn, this can be a route to instability and the undermining of democratic institutions. So, to conclude, I think that donors face presently a twofold central test. First will be to recognize that when they make choices about how to support democracy and promote development, they need to think more substantively about how their activities in one realm affect the other. Second, to understand how these choices affect or are effective by broader state-building efforts, which may or may not integrate well with democratization or development ambitions. That's all.